tensions reaching a boiling point in Cuba.
Cubans from all walks of life are being pushed to the limit.
Cuba is losing power.
Cuba relied on Venezuela for oil and for money.
They would rather have political control over the people than they would have an economy that functions.
84% of Cuba's electricity is generated using oil. That's the second highest figure in Latin America, and it's significantly higher than the global average of 1.4%. This oil is in large part imported from Venezuela. But over the past 2 years, their imports significantly reduced, causing widespread power outages. In some cases, nearly the entire island lost power, and this prompted Cuban leaders to search for alternatives. Russia resumed oil exports, and last year, Mexico became Cuba's main supplier. But Mexico will likely stop shipments, and Trump is blocking Venezuelan exports. Without an external lifeline, Cuba has no electricity, and the entire economy could come to a screeching halt. What happened to the dream of Castro? This is Cuba's existential crisis with hindsight. This is not the first time that Cuba lives through an energy shock. Its entire economic and political system is built for survival, and it's not pretty, but it has historically proven to be incredibly resilient to foreign pressure. But the challenge is different this time.
You just wait for Cuba. Their days are numbered. We're going to wake up one day, I hope in 26, in our backyard, we're going to have allies in these countries.
That Cuba is ready to fall.
Yes.
Trump seems to be after regime change in Cuba, but what business does the United States have with changing the form of government of a sovereign country? And what do regular Cubans think about this? Castro overthrew a US-backed dictator, and this was celebrated by many Cubans. He promised democracy, but then he suspended elections. Relations with the US soured, and Castro locked Cuba deep into the Soviet camp.
The Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
After they joined the Soviet trade bloc, trade kicked off. Castro sold sugar to the Soviet Union at well above market rates, and the Soviet Union sold Cuba oil, machinery, and food at heavily discounted rates. This trade provided Cuba with a lifeline, and it was a thorn in the side of the United States, who responded with sanctions and attempts to overthrow the regime. Castro's government structured the entire economy of Cuba around this foreign support, and it collapsed almost overnight.
Communism, as they used to know it, doesn't really work and must be changed.
The end of the Soviet Union caused Cuba's economic output to fall by more than a third. Preferential trade deals ended, and oil shipments stopped. Without oil, there was no electricity. Factories stopped running, and there was no fuel for transportation. Cuba relied heavily on domestically produced food, which could no longer reach the cities. There was hunger and hardship, and to survive, the Cuban government rationed food and energy and cut its industrial output to something that was more manageable. This is what Cuban leaders called its special period. The communist government reluctantly allowed for some economic reforms, like legalizing the use of US dollars, but many believed that the government could not survive this. But they stayed in power just long enough for another lifeline to emerge. Hugo Chavez became the new leader of Venezuela.
Ha obtenido el mayor apoyo popular en la historia del país.
And he saw an ally in Castro.
Somos soldados, somos revolucionarios.
They were ideologically aligned and needed something from each other. Cuba could use Venezuela's oil, and Venezuela could use Cuba's help and expertise with rolling out its own social programs. Over the next years, many tens of thousands of barrels of oil were shipped to Cuba at heavily discounted rates. In return, Cuba sent doctors and teachers to Venezuela to help Chavez with his socialist reforms. Cuba provided political support, intelligence, and services in return for oil. This created a new lifeline for Cuba, and while Venezuela replaced the Soviet Union at a much smaller scale, they helped where it mattered the most: oil. So far the backstory and what is happening today in Cuba is truly insane, but first let me ask you this. When you surf the internet on incognito mode, who's watching? Right now, it matters more than ever from which country you're browsing and how well protected you are when you surf the web. The content of your favorite streaming services is restricted to the country you're in, and when you make an online purchase, the price you see is set by an algorithm based on what they know about you and where you are. And here's the solution. CyberGhost VPN is a longtime supporter of my channel. Let's say you're planning a trip to Paris. I connect to France, and this hotel is offered to me for €131 per night. Let's now connect to the United States, and Wow, 116 euros, surprisingly. This also works for streaming. Let's look for The Office on Netflix, and it's not there. Let me open CyberGhost, connect to the UK, and now, there it is. This works on all your devices, no matter the operating system. And you can connect to 7 devices at the same time, so share it with a friend. And if you use my link in the pinned comment or description, you will pay just $2.03 per month. And you'll get 4 months for free. Give it a try. Cuba is extremely mismanaged. The state set prices for food, fuel, and electricity, and this turns basic economic decisions into political choices. The state often fixed prices far below their real costs, which forces state-owned companies to operate at a loss. This gap is covered through government subsidies, but this comes at a trade-off. The money that the government spends on keeping prices low can no longer be spent on maintenance, modernization, or investment. This is called central planning, and it limited the government's ability to upgrade its power grid. That's because they set the price for electricity so extremely low for political reasons that they simply didn't have the capital to invest into something that is less dependent on oil. Within this economic system, companies respond to targets that are set by the state, as opposed to a market-oriented system where companies respond to signals from the market. In Cuba, state-owned companies respond poorly to changing demand or rising prices, and that's what Cuba is now feeling.
Intersections can become dangerous as power outages leave traffic lights out of service. The wait to fill a car with gas can stretch into days.
For decades, Venezuela sent tens of thousands of barrels of oil per day in exchange for medical personnel, political, and security support. This became the backbone of Cuba's energy system, and while Venezuela had the largest proven oil reserves in the world, the rigs were very poorly maintained and the government had severely mismanaged this sector. In 2014, when the price of a barrel of crude suddenly dropped from $92 to $49 in a single year, this caused Venezuela's government budget to drastically shrink, and they could no longer afford subsidizing oil exports to Cuba. Algeria had provided a small but steady supply, and in some years the Dutch Antilles had sent some shipments. But Venezuela was by far the biggest supplier of oil, and this was sold at heavily discounted rates. But between 2014 and 2016, oil imports dropped by 70%, and this caused a major oil shock in Cuba.
The Venezuelan economy is on the brink of collapse, and that's bad news for Cuba.
Cuba had to improvise.
Oil drilling could begin off Cuba's coast in a matter of days.
They ramped up domestic production of oil along its northern coast, even though this produced a heavy sulfur-rich oil that was very hard to refine. The little oil that they had left was rationed. They limited how much companies could use, they ran fewer buses on shorter routes, and they scheduled power cuts by region and sector. Whereas I'm currently framing this as the result of economic mismanagement, the Cuban government has a different perspective.
There's a lack of diesel fuel, which Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel says is due to sanctions against Venezuela.
The United States has sanctions on Cuba. They restrict trade, finance, and fuel access, cutting Cuba off from credit and foreign markets. These pressures make economic difficulties even worse, turning manageable problems into chronic crises. Worsening inflation, poverty, and hardship. One of Cuba's main economic challenges is that they need foreign currency to buy oil. Tourism wasn't bringing in enough, and nickel prices had dropped. They badly needed a helping hand. In 2017, Russia began exporting oil to Cuba for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this marked the beginning of a shift in Cuban oil imports. In the period from 2020 to 2025, Venezuela was still the largest supplier. But as imports dropped in these last 2 years, Russian imports became a meaningful addition. And Mexico added increased shipments to a point that in 2025 they became Cuba's largest supplier. They both have different reasons for helping Cuba. Russia has a strategic interest in preserving a loyal ally close to the United States. They cooperate with Cuba on defense, intelligence, and they maintain close economic ties. Russia provides enough support to keep Cuba's government and economy afloat, and this partnership helps them project influence in the region. While Mexico has a much more pragmatic reason. Their state oil company, Pemex, has a hard time selling the type of oil that Cuba needs. They needed to offload storage, and Cuba became a good solution. Mexico also wants to signal to the region that they can act independently from the United States, but while maintaining a very careful posture. They have economic incentives, and they have close political ties that go back decades, but they frame their supplies as humanitarian aid that's intended to serve as short-term supply. This is unlikely to replace Venezuela's lifeline, as it could jeopardize relations with the US. Cuba is in trouble.
Demonstrators seen chanting for electricity and food, as some Cubans have experienced power outages for more than 18 hours a day.
This already started before the US capture of Maduro. Since 2019, Cuba's economic productivity has fallen by nearly 10% in a perfect storm that began with COVID. Tourism collapsed, cutting off the country's main source of US dollars. Those dollars were needed to pay for imports, and combined with US sanctions, this left Cuba unable to import enough fuel and basic goods.
Cuba's economy and energy crisis has led to repeated daily blackouts.
Emergency crews are working to restore power to 10 million people in Cuba.
Power outages were frequent and shortages widespread. But by early 2026, Cuba already had a massive shortage of oil, and Venezuela made up 50% of its imports. On January 3rd, US forces captured Maduro, and Trump announced that he would run Venezuela until there could be a transition of power. He seized oil tankers.
The US Coast Guard seizing an oil tanker just off the Venezuelan coast.
At least 7 tankers were seized in a broader attempt of the United States to control Venezuela's oil exports. This led to shortages in Cuba to go from bad to worse. In Havana, power outages reached 9 hours at a time, and some provinces only had electricity for 2 hours per day.
今天我们共同见证中国政府援助古巴紧急粮食援助项目的首批物资正式交付。
Shortly thereafter, China announced an aid package, and the following day, the Russian Interior Minister visited Cuba.
Russian Interior Minister Vladimir Kolokoltsev landed in Havana on January 20th, 2026.
Cuba has been in this position before. When the Soviet Union collapsed, oil shipments also stopped almost overnight. The government responded by contracting its economy until it reached a level that was survivable. This meant that their productivity was cut in half, and they entered survival mode. They survived by rationing food and power, and they allowed limited economic reforms without addressing the underlying structural issues. The communist system survived at the cost of a poorer population, a smaller economy, and a decade of emergency measures. What Trump is increasingly doing is that he's using the leverage that he has as a big nation to force the hand of smaller nations. Cuba is weaker than it has been in decades. Trump responds by maximizing pressure with the explicit belief that the Cuban system can be forced to change. He's using all forces at his disposal to make the crisis in Cuba more difficult to solve. Mexico is a good example of this because they see economic benefit in exporting oil to Cuba, which would be a great help for them, but they have to be careful with not overstepping and upsetting the United States. Cuba anchored its national story in the belief that the United States is the enemy. They rallied nationalism around resistance, and uniquely, this was kept alive after the death of Castro. The current government interprets today's energy blackouts less as structural mismanagement and more as economic warfare. The fuel shortages are blamed on sanctions, financial isolation, and the United States strong-arming potential suppliers. Washington is making it impossible for Cuba because it doesn't like its form of politics, and for symbolic reasons, taking a tough stance on Cuba plays well with voters in Florida. What is so different about the crisis today is that after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a very tough period, but a new lifeline emerged, Venezuela. But right now, there's not a lot of likely candidates that can emerge to provide that same kind of support. You may think of China or Russia, but China is not an oil exporter, and Russia doesn't have the reserves and needs its oil revenues to fund its war efforts. The era of guaranteed external life support is ending, and Cuba is running out of time to choose how it adapts. Don't forget to click on the link in the description to get a special discount that CyberGhost VPN is granting to our subscribers. This VPN protects your data while you browse, and it gives you full access to all blocked content on the internet. It is totally risk-free, so check it out. Link in the description.